But then your saturated fat intake as well is something that you do want to consider. And again, this kind of comes back to what we said earlier, where if you're following the rest of the kind of dietary recommendations, you're probably taking care of this to some degree, because what you often see with saturated fat intake is that people begin to rack it up when they start to consume lots of processed food. So, for example, let's say you have a couple of muffins or a load of cookies in the evening or something, and suddenly you've gotten like 20 grams of saturated fat through all the added butter that you just didn't even realize. It's not like you're layering butter on your meals, but it's coming through these indirect sources. So that's often the case. So if you're taking care of like reducing your processed food intake, not eating loads of junk, when you're eating out, you're making smart choices, you've probably taken care of most of that. And all you need to do on top of that really is just, cook with unsaturated oil sources. If you're instead of butter, for example, if you're cooking lots of meals with some sort of cooking fat, that's something that you can do. Um, if you're having, 6 slices of toast a day, you're not lathering them all in butter, swap it out for peanut butter or something else, or even just half and half, something along those lines, then you'll be in a good place. But they're the types of things that you want to be considering. You want to look at your diet as a whole and then ask yourself, what's actually contributing to my saturated fat intake personally? Because what you might see is that you're getting in maybe 8 to 10% of total calories from saturated fat. It's coming from your olive oil, your salmon, your peanut butter, things that you didn't even consider as saturated fat sources, but they're just indirect contributors. So for you, you don't need to reduce further. You're not likely to benefit very much from reducing further. And the problem with viewing like saturated fat as an inherently bad thing that should be totally avoided is that you end up avoiding foods that have other beneficial properties, such as, for example, dairy intake contributing to your calcium, your vitamin D, your protein intake, etc. If you,
Like red meat and iron.
yeah, red meat and iron. What else is there that's within saturated fat rich foods? We mentioned already dark chocolate, for example. You're getting polyphenols, you're getting theobromine, you're getting other benefits from that dark chocolate that are beneficial for vascular health and potentially for cognitive health long term, that if you were to look solely at the saturated fat intake, you might end up missing out on it. Okay. So if you're having a bit of dark chocolate here and there, the odd time you have a bit of butter on your toast, there's some saturated fat in your salmon, there's some saturated fat in your nuts, there's some saturated fat in your olive oil. They're not the things you need to be worried about. It's more so that if you're really starting to take your fat sources, bump them in the direction of the saturated fat direction, and then your overall fat intake on top of that is composing a large quantity of the diet, then that starts to become a bit more important. So the people who really need to worry about their specific fat sources in a little bit more detail are those who already have a very high fat diet. So if you have a high carbohydrate, low fat diet, you're eating lots of fruits and vegetables, lots of fiber, you're not really adding fat to much of your meals. Even if you're adding a bit of saturated fat there, like it's probably not adding to much of a risk really, because the overall intake is still low. Whereas you could have someone who's on a very low carbohydrate, very high fat diet, let's say 60, 70% from fat of their calories. And even if they're trying to choose unsaturated sources most of the time, they could still be accumulating a lot of saturated fat just through those indirect sources with very minimal from those more direct sources. So for the person who is on a low carb, high fat diet, pay more attention to it. If you're on a higher carb, lower fat diet, you probably need to pay less attention to it, provided you're taking care of all the other recommendations. So I think that's a fair summary for the purpose of this episode anyway.
100%. And the only thing I'll add to that, well, two things is we probably just want to avoid trans fats in
Yes,
general.
for sure.
Now, that's fortunate enough in terms of like most things, they're trying to lower their trans fat intake anyway. Like, most things you buy, unless it's like fucking, I don't know, cookies or something, like
Yeah.
probably have very low trans fat anyway. So it's not a huge concern unless, again, you have a hugely processed diet. So lower your trans fats if you are eating a lot of trans fats. But on top of that, this is one of those things where I actually think it's kind of against what we generally recommend, because we don't generally recommend a lot of like blood testing or anything like that. Your cholesterol, really easy marker to just get tested. Do it once a year, every second year, whatever, and see where it's at. And then you can be like, okay, this is where my diet is currently bringing my blood cholesterol levels or my blood lipids, and then all of a sudden you can be like, okay, I need to make a change, right? And the thing about it is, and this is the thing you'll find if you do go out and research this stuff, is that the research is pretty clear, but when you actually talk to people that are in the field, they have different opinions of how changes you should make or what numbers you should be looking at. The one thing I will say on that is, don't move the goalpost. Don't be like, okay, well, 3 is the cutoff, and then you have like other modifying factors where you're like, oh well, I have a lot of antioxidants in the diet, or I got a fucking coronary calcium score and it was fine. Don't move the goalposts. Just be like, okay, well, if you want to have good general cholesterol levels, we probably want that LDL at least below 3, right? So that's something to consider. Go out and get a blood test. You can go to your doctor. You can go to something like Let's Get Checked. Like we have a discount code for Let's Get Checked of Triage 20 if you want to use that. But just getting your blood lipids tested, really fucking simple intervention. And at least then you know where you're at with your cholesterol level, and then where your diet is actually trending you. Because unfortunately, again, this is one of those things where you're laying down the foundation of this stuff now, and it's probably not going to affect you until you're 40, 50, 60, whatever, right? So the sooner you can get this sorted, the better, right? And it's not that expensive to get your cholesterol tested, right?